Forget the marble statues, forget the grand speeches about Roman glory and honor. Behind those towering columns and flowing togas of power lies a place so dark, history itself tried to erase it. A place where senators were forced to bring their wives and daughters, not to receive imperial favor, but to offer them up as living sacrifices. A place where weddings weren't celebrations of love, but staged events so the emperor could rape the bride in front of her parents, while the audience was expected to applaud. Inside the palace on Palatine Hill, the very heart of the most powerful empire on earth, Caligula built a sexual hellscape that even Dante would dare not imagine. Noblewomen raised with strict morals were dragged into worship rituals where gods were just an excuse for sacrificing bodies. And the children, yes, children, sat and watched as their parents were humiliated before a crowd, or waited in silence, knowing they might be the next offering. That palace no longer stands, but if you listen closely, beneath the cold stone ruins, you can still hear the screams of souls shattered by the lust of a mad emperor. This wasn't just a dark chapter in history, it was a terrifying reminder: when humans are given absolute power, they will burn everything, even their own humanity. Part 1. Caligula, the making of a monster. Before the sadist, before the tyrant, there was a boy in tiny boots. He was born Gaius Julius Caesar Augustus Germanicus in 12 CE, a name soaked in blood, glory, and unbearable expectation. His father, Germanicus, was no ordinary general. He was Rome's golden boy, victorious on the battlefield, adored by the people, and whispered to be the next emperor. His mother, Agrippina the Elder, was the granddaughter of Augustus himself, the founder of the empire. From the outside, Gaius was born to rule, but power in Rome was not inherited. It was hunted, traded, and paid for in blood. As a toddler, he followed Germanicus on military campaigns. The soldiers dressed him in a tiny soldier's uniform, breastplate, helmet, and all, and laughed as he stomped through the camps. They called him Caligula, Little Boots, a harmless nickname, a moment of joy in a violent world. But history would turn that name into something else. A curse. The death spiral begins. At age 7, Caligula's world began to collapse. His father, Germanicus, the man expected to lead Rome into a new golden age, died suddenly in Syria. The official cause was illness, but whispers told a different story: poison, orchestrated by Emperor Tiberius himself. Germanicus was too beloved, too popular, and in Rome, popularity was dangerous. His mother, Agrippina, refused to stay silent. She accused Tiberius publicly, a deadly act in a world where emperors killed with a glance. So she was exiled and starved to death. One by one, Caligula's brothers, Drusus, Nero, Lucius, were imprisoned, executed, or erased from existence. Imagine being a child watching your bloodline disappear. Not to plague, not to war, but to politics, to paranoia. The lesson of survival. By the time he was 10, Caligula had learned the most brutal lesson Rome could offer. Power doesn't protect you, it destroys you, unless you control it first. He became a master of masks. He smiled when he wanted to scream. He obeyed while inside he plotted. He learned to blend in, to survive. Because in Rome, survival was a rare skill. Then came the Capri years. Tiberius, now a paranoid, aging emperor, summoned the boy to live with him at the imperial villa on the island of Capri. To the public, this was an honor. In reality, it was a prison. Capri, Rome's most beautiful hell Capri, was no ordinary palace. It was a fortress of shadows, a place where orgies, torture, and psychological games played out behind marble walls. Tiberius didn't just rule from Capri, he unleashed himself there. Rumors spoke of boys tossed from cliffs after they no longer pleased, of rituals that blurred the line between devotion and depravity. And in the middle of it all, Caligula watched, too young to resist, too smart to rebel. He studied Tiberius like a spider watches its prey. I must not feel, I must learn, I must become the thing they all fear. From survivor to predator, years of cruelty didn't just damage Caligula, they reshaped him. He didn't just learn how power corrupts, he learned how pleasure from pain could be used as a weapon. He saw that fear was stronger than love. That domination, not affection, brought obedience. When Tiberius finally died in 37 CE, whether from illness, conspiracy, or even Caligula's hand, the empire rejoiced. The people cheered for Little Boots, son of the heroic Germanicus. They believed the nightmare was over, but the nightmare was just beginning. Part 2. The coronation, Rome's shattered hope. When Tiberius died in 37 CE, the empire didn't just mourn, it exhaled. For over 2 decades, Rome had lived under the shadow of a ghost. Tiberius, once a skilled general, had become a bitter, paranoid hermit, ruling not from the Senate or the Forum, but from his cliffside palace on Capri, surrounded by spies, torturers, and whispers of perversion. He didn't lead, he loomed, and the empire suffocated under his silence. So when news of his death spread, it was as if Rome had been released from a curse, a prince born of legend. And who stood ready to claim the imperial purple? Gaius Caligula, son of Germanicus, grandson, by blood, of Augustus himself. A direct heir, not just to the throne, but to the myth of Rome. To the people, he was more than a man. He was the return of a golden age, the son of a war hero, the survivor of tyranny, the boy in little boots who had walked through hell and come out smiling. In him, the people projected every longing they had buried for years: justice, prosperity, joy, freedom. The euphoric beginning, the streets of Rome erupted, temples rang with prayers of thanksgiving. Statues of the hated Tiberius were torn down, burned, or defaced. Even the Senate bowed willingly. For once, the people and the patricians agreed. Caligula was the answer. In his first acts as emperor, he fulfilled the dream. Freed prisoners condemned under Tiberius's secret trials. Recalled political exiles, many had thought they'd never see Rome again. Doubled bonuses for the Praetorian Guard, ensuring their loyalty early. Hosted grand public spectacles, gladiator games, races, animal hunts, plays. The city, for a brief moment, felt alive again. Even hardened senators, long used to playing games of flattery and fear, dared to hope. They praised Caligula's generosity, his eloquence, his divine clemency. Many believed the horrors of the last reign had been buried with Tiberius. The false dawn, for 7 months, Rome basked in this newfound light. Historians described it as a second birth of the empire. Suetonius wrote of a Rome reborn. Philo of Alexandria called Caligula a gift from the gods. But history has a cruel sense of irony, because false dawns are always brightest before the darkness falls. The turning point, the fever. In late 37 CE, everything changed, and it began not with policy, but with a pulse. Caligula fell violently ill. Ancient sources describe it as a brain fever, accompanied by seizures, hallucinations, unconsciousness. For nearly a month, the emperor hovered between life and death. Rome panicked. The empire teetered on the edge of a succession crisis. Prayers were offered in every temple. Animal sacrifices filled the streets with blood. The empire didn't love Caligula yet, but they feared the return of chaos more. And then he woke up. But something, or someone else, opened their eyes. The man who returned was not the boy they crowned. At first, the changes were subtle. Lavish public spending, far beyond even Roman standards. Strange requests from the palace, building floating palaces, gold statues of himself. An unpredictable temper, increasing isolation from advisors and Senate sessions. But to those closest to him, his sisters, staff, Praetorian commanders, it was clear the man who survived the fever had not just returned from death. He believed he had conquered it. Caligula began speaking in divine terms, not metaphorically, but literally. He was no longer simply princeps, first among equals. He now demanded to be worshipped as a god. He would walk the halls of the palace dressed as Jupiter, or Apollo, or Venus, depending on his mood. He erected statues of himself in temples, even in Jerusalem, where it nearly sparked rebellion. He renamed months, cities, even festivals after himself. The boy in little boots had disappeared. In his place stood a man who believed he was infallible, untouchable, eternal. The storm begins. And with divinity came madness. Caligula, once hailed as Rome's savior, now mocked the Senate in public, appointed his horse as consul, perhaps sarcastically, perhaps not, and began to see threats in every shadow. But this wasn't Tiberius's cold paranoia. This was something theatrical, flamboyant, unpredictable, and deeply cruel. Behind the laughter, behind the gold, behind the dazzling displays, Rome had unknowingly crowned a storm in human form. And soon no one, not senators, not generals, not even children, would be safe. Part 3. When the palace became a brothel. The birth of decay. Power doesn't always arrive with thunder. Sometimes it whispers in the dark and waits for the moment you're too broken to fight it. That's what happened to Caligula. After the fever, the mask slips. The man who recovered from that near-fatal illness wasn't the same ruler Rome had celebrated just months before. Something inside him had died. Or worse, something darker had been born. Gone was the golden boy, the son of Germanicus. In his place stood a man possessed by a single obsession, to remind the world that he was God, and everyone else was clay in his hands. And so, behind the gleaming marble columns of the Palatine Hill Palace, Rome's center of power began to rot, the palace as a stage for submission. It started quietly, whispers among the servants, nervous glances, a sudden change in the air. Long-time palace staff were abruptly replaced or repurposed. Young male slaves were dragged into private chambers and emerged silent, broken. Female attendants, once protectors of imperial dignity, became prey, victims of midnight selections, where beauty replaced loyalty. But these weren't hidden violations in shadowed corridors. They were performances, designed to be seen, witnessed, obeyed. Caligula didn't seek intimacy. He sought dominance, public, humiliating, irreversible. Power as ritual humiliation. Soon his hunger grew. Senators' wives were no longer symbols of Roman virtue. They were summoned, stripped, and paraded like livestock. Sometimes in front of their own husbands, sometimes with their children watching. "She has beautiful eyes," Caligula would smirk during dinner. "I wonder what they look like when she begs." No one laughed, but everyone applauded. Because silence was survival, resistance was a death sentence. One senator objected, his name vanished from the records. Another's wife refused, her youngest child disappeared. The brothel of the empire. But Rome hadn't yet seen the full depths. Caligula wasn't satisfied with isolated acts of cruelty. He wanted to make a statement that Rome itself belonged to him, body and soul. So he turned the palace, the heart of the empire, into a literal brothel, but not with common prostitutes. He filled it with the wives and daughters of the Senate, of generals, of Rome's most noble blood. They were forced to serve not only Caligula, but his guards, his guests, foreign ambassadors, even slaves. The emperor constructed themed rooms like depraved theaters, complete with viewing platforms, rotating beds, and elaborate staging. Names and services were recorded in ledgers like temple offerings or tax receipts. And Caligula? He watched it all, not as a man, but as a god in human skin, laughing, directing, sometimes joining in, sometimes simply observing like a theater critic watching tragedy. To him, these weren't crimes, they were rituals, proof that no virtue, no honor, no family name could stand against his will. The collapse of social order. This wasn't just sexual debauchery, it was systematic social collapse. Fathers offered their daughters in hopes of tax relief, husbands delivered wives to avoid execution. Priests and military officers became pimps to maintain favor. It wasn't governance, it was sexual terrorism, weaponized as imperial doctrine. Status means nothing, only I exist. That was the true message. You think your name matters, your virtue, your titles. I can take your daughter, your wife, your soul, and make you watch. And watch they did. Some hoped silence would save them, some hoped participation would shield them. But no one was immune. Even his own sisters weren't spared. Rumors swirled of incest, ritual abuse, and forced pregnancies. Caligula had become not a ruler, but a storm, devouring everything Rome once stood for. The legacy of horror. By now, Rome itself was sick. Dignity was currency, virtue was punishment. Power was humiliation. The emperor had reshaped the empire in his own twisted image, where pleasure was pain and obedience was not enough unless it came with degradation. Final words. The brothel palace wasn't just a symbol of madness, it was a system designed to destroy, dominate, and silence. Rome would never be the same, because when your god is a sadist, there are no temples, only stages, and everyone becomes an actor. In a play you can never escape. Part 4. Sex as a weapon, the destruction of Roman identity. Caligula didn't just wield sex, he turned it into a sword, a doctrine, a virus designed to dismantle the very soul of Rome. Rome, a civilization built on order. Rome prided itself on virtues, pietas, and gravitas, virtues of manhood, family loyalty, and public dignity. The Senate was sacred, the family was inviolable. Sex, while present in private and poetic, was not power. But Caligula understood something the moralists didn't. The fastest way to destroy a civilization isn't with armies. It's by erasing the meaning of virtue. And what better way to do that than through sex? Caligula's calculated depravity, his crimes weren't spontaneous. They were scripted performances meant to reshape reality. Each act of abuse had a message. Your daughter? She's not yours, she's mine. Your wife? She kneels to me, and so do you. Your gods? They watch in silence, because I am one now. He demanded total submission, not just of bodies, but of identity, lineage, and belief. Ritualized collapse of family. The emperor ordered fathers to escort their daughters into his chamber, then wait outside, smiling. He made husbands bathe and perfume their wives, then present them for group acts like offerings. He instructed brothers to hold down their sisters while priests blessed the room with incense. This wasn't sex, this was ritualized annihilation. Caligula wasn't raping women, he was raping Rome's soul. And the most chilling part, the victims applauded, because the alternative, protest, resistance, defiance, meant torture, death, and the obliteration of your entire bloodline. The Senate turned sewer. The Roman Senate, once the heart of republic virtue, became a theater of degradation. Senators gave speeches while their wives were forced beneath the benches, performing sex acts silently. Debates on taxes and warfare were interrupted by moans and laughter from the emperor's box. Caligula would call a vote, then call a woman to his lap, often a senator's daughter, and violate her while her father raised his hand in approval. This wasn't just humiliation, this was the programming of silence. He taught Rome's elite that their dignity had a price, and it could be bought with a glance, a gesture, a scream behind a locked door. Religious ruin, desecrating the divine temples, weren't spared. Vestal virgins, women sworn to chastity on pain of death, were forced to perform in sexual rites. Priests were ordered to include orgiastic blessings in imperial ceremonies. Statues of Roman gods were defiled during ceremonial orgies, while Caligula declared himself divine incarnate. Religion became theater, faith became foreplay, and the emperor, the god of blasphemy, he replaced Jupiter's thunder with his own moans. The psychological weapon, erasure of the self. Caligula understood something terrifying, a concept lost on most tyrants. If I make you thank me after I destroy your child, if I make you call it honor after I spit on your family name, then I haven't just broken you, I've deleted you. Rome was no longer a republic, nor an empire. It was a cult of silence, wrapped in purple robes and drenched in perfume to cover the rot. The theater of compliance. People smiled, they clapped, foreign dignitaries bowed, senators laughed too hard at his jokes. And women, they learned how to keep their eyes from trembling, how to kneel without tears, how to survive without soul. The empire became a machine of complicity, fueled by fear and polished by ritual. Rome didn't burn from outside, it rotted from the inside, beginning with the emperor's bed. And yet, behind every forced smile, every trembling toast, every prayer to the emperor god, something stirred: shame, rage, memory. Even monsters cast shadows, and in those shadows, a conspiracy was forming. Part 5. The conspiracy. When the monster went too far. There comes a moment when even fear breaks. when shame turns into rage, when silence sharpens into steel. By 40 CE, Rome was bleeding internally. The orgies were no longer rumors whispered in alleyways. They were routine events, paraded like circus shows. Senators stood in line like cattle, daughters were presented like offerings. Temples had become stage props in Caligula's theater of perversion. But it was no longer enough. Caligula began to call himself a god, not as a metaphor, but as a divine fact. He demanded worship, not admiration. Statues of Jupiter were torn down to make room for his own. Altars once meant for sacred rites were repurposed for flesh. Sex became a sacrament. Refusing it was blasphemy. Man, woman, child, no one could say no. The breaking point, not a moment, but a memory. There was no single act that sparked the fall. It wasn't a murder, a rape, or a law. It was memory, the accumulated weight of suffering. Fathers who had watched their daughters offered like livestock, husbands who had perfumed their wives for another man, guards who had stood still while children screamed behind marble doors. They were not rebels, they were not revolutionaries. They were Romans, loyal, once proud, and now broken. And in the cracks of that shame, a single ember began to glow: vengeance. The plot within the palace. It wasn't a grand rebellion. There were no banners, no declarations, just a few men, Praetorian guards, once sworn to protect Caligula with their lives. Now they were preparing to end his. Why? Because even loyalty has limits. Some had watched their own families humiliated. Others had carried out orders that haunted them every night. All of them had seen too much and understood too late what Rome had become. Their plan was not just to kill the emperor, it was to erase him from marble, from memory, from time itself. January 24th, 41 CE, the day the god bled. It happened underground, a private corridor beneath the Palatine Hill, the perfect place for a god to die. Caligula walked, surrounded by men he thought were still loyal. Then silence, then steel. They didn't stab to kill, they stabbed to punish. Each blade was a memory, each wound a scream remembered. He was stabbed over 30 times. Some say his limbs were severed, others say his face was unrecognizable. The truth, it doesn't matter. The god bled like any man, and when he fell, Rome exhaled. The aftermath, ashes and amnesia. Within hours, the palace was locked down, his body buried in haste, his statues pulled down, his name scratched from walls, the brothel rooms sealed, the records burned. A new emperor was declared, Claudius, limping, stammering, overlooked. Rome pretended to heal, but trauma doesn't die with a tyrant. It festers, in bloodlines, in nightmares, in the silence of rooms that once echoed with forced laughter. The lesson of Caligula. He reigned for just 3 years and 10 months, but in that short span, he redefined what it meant to fall. Not just as a ruler, but as a human. Because his legacy isn't just about madness. It's about a system that allowed it. A culture that looked away, and people who told themselves, as long as it's not me, I will survive. Until it was them. Caligula proved that unchecked power doesn't just corrupt. It erases the concept of self, in both ruler and ruled. He showed that civilization is not held together by laws, but by fear, empathy, and collective memory. And that the worst monsters aren't born. They are built, brick by brick, wound by wound, within marble palaces. And so, remember this, Rome didn't fall because of war. It rotted from the inside while men in purple robes smiled over corpses and called it governance. Part 6, The Legacy of a Mad God. The ruins still speak. Rome never forgets. Even when the stones stay silent, the blood remembers. Today on the Palatine Hill, tourists wander through the ruins. They point at pillars. They marvel at ancient mosaics. They smile for selfies in front of crumbling walls, beneath plaques carved with Latin too worn to read. But what they don't see is what those stones once witnessed. They don't hear the sounds that once echoed through those halls, the muffled cries, the pleading whispers, the quiet, obedient silence of people who had surrendered not just their bodies, but their will. Because beneath those foundations were not just rooms, They were chambers of violation, of humiliation, of state-sanctioned suffering. Caligula didn't build a palace, he built a monument to submission, a place where Rome's highest became the lowest, where the sacred became desecrated. These weren't just crimes, they were rituals. Every act of abuse wasn't random. It was calculated, intentional, designed to send a message that virtue was meaningless and resistance was suicide. He turned Rome's elite into actors in his theater of shame, and worst of all, the audience clapped. Even now, archaeologists uncover secret corridors, hidden cellars, and forgotten frescoes, their meanings unclear, their origins tied to that reign. And each discovery isn't just about architecture, it's about a civilization that saw the abyss and kept walking. This was never about lust, it was always about power. Caligula didn't destroy Rome with fire or steel, he destroyed it by rewriting its values. He taught the nobility that obedience is survival. He taught soldiers that orders matter more than conscience. He taught families that honor can be bought, sold, or stripped away in one imperial command. And slowly, Rome changed. Not from outside invasion, but from moral rot, born in the emperor's bedchamber and spread like a plague through the Senate, the temples, the barracks, and the streets. A reign of 4 years, a trauma of centuries. Caligula ruled for just 1,400 days. But the damage he inflicted on minds, on traditions, on the very idea of Rome lasted generations. You see, tyrants don't just hurt people, they train them to hurt others. They program society to accept the unacceptable. The men who survived him went on to become fathers, senators, priests, teachers, and they carried those scars, many of them invisible. Some turned their trauma into silence, others passed it on. That's the real legacy of a mad god, not just death, but the death of decency. So who's to blame? Was Caligula born broken? Maybe. Was he made into a monster by a childhood soaked in fear, blood, and manipulation? Absolutely. But the deeper question isn't who he was. It's why so many followed him. Why didn't anyone stop him sooner? Why did so many obey? Why did they kneel, even when their own children were screaming? The answer is as old as power itself. Because people feared losing what little they had left. Because survival felt easier than resistance. Because when evil wears a crown, silence becomes the easiest kind of loyalty. The stones still stand, the warning still echoes. When you visit the Palatine Hill, you won't see blood, you won't hear screams. But that doesn't mean they're gone. They're buried in every cracked wall, in every silent marble hallway, in every carved image that once glorified an empire, now ashamed to remember itself. Caligula may be dead, but his lesson remains. A final warning, so the next time someone tells you history repeats itself, don't just nod, don't just quote it. Understand it, because history only repeats when people forget. And the moment you believe it can't happen again is the exact moment it already has.